Hello and welcome to episode 46 of A Gamer Looks at 40. And this is a really special episode for me. This is a fun one. This is one of the ones I didn't expect. Shows like mine generally don't get guests like these. And I know I'm talking them up, but I'm really appreciative of what you're about to hear. I think it's going to be really cool. Video game magazines were a central part of my growing up as a gamer back in the late 90s, 2000s era. It wasn't just a place for news. It wasn't just a place for sometimes cartoons and sometimes letters and sometimes contests. It was a window to games that I would probably never play. If you grew up in that era, you were probably not at the age where you were buying your own games. And even if you were, money was tight. You know, we didn't have a lot of money for video games and all the extra things that we wanted. There was no way we could possibly play everything. And reviews from video game magazines, they helped inform our opinions and make those decisions. And for everything else, that's how we experienced it. I mean, there's complete consoles I totally missed out on, like the PlayStation 1. I know literally next to nothing about the PlayStation 1, but I can talk about Metal Gear Solid because I read about it in GamePro or Electronic Gaming Monthly. The magazine I just mentioned is the focus of today's episode. I am extremely grateful and lucky to have three of the editors of Electronic Gaming Monthly joining me today on the podcast. We talk about the old days of the magazine, what it took to become an editor, and just a day in the life of that fantastic periodical that was considered by most people in my circle the magazine to read. As I mentioned in the interview, I had Nintendo Power and GamePro because that's what my parents got me for Christmas subscriptions. But whenever I grabbed an EGM, that I knew that was the source. Those were the reviews I could trust. They felt independent, they felt honest, and they felt like real journalism. So sit back, relax, and enjoy an hour-long conversation between myself and three amazing people who took time out of their very busy schedules to chat with me about the old days at EGM.
Do you play video games? Call and power up with EGM, Electronic Gaming Monthly.
Get cool reviews, secret codes, tips, game maps, and previews like American Sammy's Wanderers from Ease. Thrilling adventure and graphics for play on Super NES.
EGM, excellent.
This excellent TV offer is only available by calling 808-GAMERS. Get 4 issues of EGM plus one of these guides and this tips book free. Pay by check or pay by credit card now and get a bonus tip sheet free. Call 808-GAMERS. That's 808-GAMERS.
All right, guys, thanks again for taking out the time to join me for this conversation about EGM, life at the magazine, how things were back in those days. But first, just so everyone can associate name with voice, Greg, if you want to start off with introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Greg. I was previews editor and reviews editor during my time at EGM, and if there's any technical issues with this podcast, it's my fault.
Drops in quality. Totally. CJ?
Hi, I'm Chris Johnston, but most people know me as CJ. I was the news editor on EGM back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And before that, in 94, I was associate editor at EGM for a while.
Awesome. Associate editor. We'll have to get into exactly what that kind of means, what those roles were, especially how you kind of progressed into news, which I think is an interesting angle we haven't really talked about. And then Shu, please.
Hey, everyone. I'm Dan Shu, but everyone calls me Shu. I started at EGM. I was a reader before anything, and then I was an associate editor, then letters and previews editor, and then I left for about a year, came back, and then I was editor-in-chief for a few years.
That's a jump. That's a real jump from associate to editor-in-chief. I'd like to explore that as well. So thanks again, guys, for taking the time. So like I said, kind of in the virtual green room, the goal of this conversation is just kind of get a sense of what it was like to be at EGM in that environment, a little bit about my personal experience with the magazine. I never had a subscription to it, but I had friends who did. And EGM always felt like the one you could trust. It was the little more serious one. You know, I had Nintendo Power, and that was like an advertising arm, and everyone knew it. And GamePro was kind of skewed more towards, I think, preteens and younger kids. But EGM, when I read that, it always felt professional, but fun, like a lot of fun. And it felt like, oh, these are like the reviews and opinions I can trust. How was it inside the world of EGM during those kind of late 90s, early 2000s era when all three of you were there? You know, I always imagined it as like a kid's playground with like arcade games and consoles. And I'm sure that's not the case, but I'm sure it also wasn't this boring cubicle world either. So I'm curious, like, what was it like? What was the environment at EGM?
It was a little like how you first described it.
Really? Okay.
I remember the first time I went in for an interview, and then they were showing me around. Joe Funk, the editorial director, was kind of showing me around, and I was just like stunned because there's all these guys at their computers, and then at their desks were also TVs and PlayStation 1s and Saturns and Super Nintendos and Sega Genesis consoles. And I'm like, oh my God, this is a work environment. and we had, our Chicago office was near Midway. So we used to have, they would send us arcade games to cover, but because they were only half hour away, it was really easy to ship in full-size arcade machines. So we had a lot of Midway games like that's, you know, CJ, you and I played a ton of these, like NBA Showtime and NFL Blitz and Hydro Thunder and games like that. So it did look like how you're describing it.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Was that was that your experience, CJ?
Yeah, that was my experience as well. You know, during the mid 90s, the beginning of EGM, like a lot of people got hired as writers there because they were arcade gamers. They met other editors at the arcade, or they knew somebody who worked at EGM. Like a lot of the old staff, early 90s staff, anyway, were just gamers. They weren't writers. They weren't even magazine editors. They weren't trained as that. They were just friends who knew each other, or they met other players at the arcade and got them interested in working at the magazine. And it changed a little bit in the late 90s when we actually started hiring people who knew what they were doing, like real writers and, you know, not people who were just out of high school. Because when I first started working there in 94, I was a junior in high school. It was between my junior and senior year. And that was like typical, right? Like EGM, they would get people who were mainly gamers, and, you know, you couldn't find writers who were gamers back in the early 90s. So, but that changed, and I think for the better.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I was thinking about it earlier. I was kind of putting things together and researching. I was wondering what age you guys were when you were there, because I remember reading EGM when I was in high school, right? Like I'm 41 now, so I was like 15 when I was a sophomore, 16 as a junior. And I'm like, these guys aren't that much older than I am. So were they my age writing for EGM? Clearly, yeah. I mean,
Yes.
Well,
Yes,
I was
17 when I got hired. So it was very, very early on.
I was 23 when I started
Okay.
there. Yeah.
Okay.
I was probably 23, 25-ish, something like that.
Okay.
I remember when you were saying that, how old were we when we started? I remember, I think it was Shu, because I don't know how much older you are than me, Shu, but I remember jokes about you being the old man because you were pushing 30 at one point.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Let me see. I started in. I'm 50 now. I started in 96,
Okay, so
so
you're
I
4
was
years older.
20. I was 25. Yeah, when I started.
I like how
but-
you could be pushing 30 at 25. Only like a younger person, like my age, at that would say that. That's really funny.
Well, Greg wasn't there when I
No,
first
I started
started.
much later than Shu.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So his timing's probably right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That sounds really cool. And so it does sound like it was the kind of environment where it sounds like a very creative and fun environment, especially early on. You know, if you have a bunch of, I'm going to say young kids. Again, I'm 40. I can say that now about 17-year-olds. But you have a young, you know, almost adults writing and hanging out. Wow, those must have been just really exciting times. You know, working at that magazine, you were there for some amazing moments, console releases, E3s, reveals. What was the one video game cultural event that dominated the magazine at some point?
I mean, I remember for me, one thing that sticks in my head was because when I came on was right when the Dreamcast was sort of getting going. Right? Like I started at Expert Gamer in 99 and then came over to EGM in 2000. And so the Dreamcast was kind of like, it was running full guns, but the PlayStation 2 was very close. And then I still remember getting the email, I think it was from Sam Kennedy, where he told us that he'd heard that they were canceling the Dreamcast. That was kind of like a keystone moment for my time there anyway, because I remember, I think, having a conversation with CJ about it and just saying, like, that can't be true, right? They're not going to do that. And then suddenly, oh my God, it is true. This is happening.
And had you done a lot of coverage on it up till then? Because obviously the Dreamcast had a short run, but I don't even remember a time when the Dreamcast was considered like, oh my God, this is the new hotness. This is the next level. For me, it always went to PS2. That Dreamcast was kind of that forgotten gem.
I think everyone always hedged their bets a little bit, right? Like,
sure.
I think we all, and guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, like EGM, we had a bunch of Dreamcast covers. We did a bunch of Dreamcast coverage, but I think there was always sort of that, like, you know, postscript behind everything. It's just like, but the PlayStation 2 is coming, right? Like, so this is really cool. But yeah.
I think for us though, like because I was about to answer your question saying console releases really felt like that, where there's like a shift in the culture, there's new technology and exciting new games, and you have to remember, like, we always got access to games early, right? Like if it's like PlayStation 2's coming or GameCube's coming, whatever it was, like we were playing games on those systems months, sometimes over a year before it actually released in public. So that kind of shifts the kind of vibe and the culture at the office a little bit, because now it's like, oh, we're playing these new generation games. Like we need better TVs. Everyone needs to upgrade their TVs because we need to upgrade to whatever it was at the time, like S video or component video. I forgot whatever that we were using back in those days. And then it would be like, oh, now like Xbox is out, and now we could link together and play local network games, and then so that would ship like okay, now we're playing 16-player games on Halo, which we weren't doing in previous console generations. So that was always a shift. But I think for us, like, and what you're describing, Bill, from the outside, like as a gamer, like for us, like even if the Saturn, for example, weren't as mainstream popular, the Dreamcast, etc., like we I don't know if I really notice that kind of stuff. Like you're aware, you know what sells, you know what's popular, and you try to cover stuff that's popular. But at the same time, it's like we get to just play everything that's cool. It's stuff from Japan, arcade machines that weren't out yet, right? So like for us, like our responsibility, I felt, was always like, let's talk about what's cool, what we think is cool, what's really whether this game is going to be obscure or from a small publisher or not, that didn't matter. Like we were going to cover everything or look at everything at least. So I think for us, that's why like games, like systems like the Dreamcast and Saturn were so loved at the office, because we had access and we played everything.
Yeah, and one of the cultural sort of touchstones that sticks out in my mind is when Wind Waker was first debuted, with that sort of Looney Tunes-ish, very cartoony look, and I believe we called it Zelda in the magazine at one point. There was a really big debate just amongst the staff whether that was the right direction or not, and you would also hear people talking about it, outside of the magazine and at game stores and stuff, that Zelda was either going the right way or the wrong way. And, I think people even still debate whether the Wind Waker look is good or not, or, so that was a really interesting time to be on the magazine as well. Just not only, having that opinion in the magazine, but also seeing it reflected on the internet, which was coming up at that time. And, it felt like a larger conversation was happening around that too.
Right. And a quick aside, that Wind Waker was very shocking because they had that E3 with the big Zelda reveal. I believe that was before Wind Waker, if I'm right on that.
Yeah, where
That-
it was with Link and Ganon fighting each other.
Yeah.
And it was like an adult Link. It almost looked
Yeah.
like the adult Link from
Yep.
N64. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that really sparked a lot of the confusion by people as well when you get this more like cartoony, cel-shaded look. Were you guys there for that Zelda reveal?
I was there for that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, you were sending
How?
I was there
Pictures
for
back.
both. I was there for when the GameCube first was revealed, and they showed off that Link versus Ganon fight, where there's more realistic looking, more Ocarina of Time looking, and then also there for the Zelda debut as well.
What was the energy in the room like for that? Because I've seen videos of it, people, shaky camcorders, and I can't imagine being in a room full of hype like that.
Any Zelda reveal, it was a room full
Sure.
of hype, right? Like there was energy, whether people liked it or not. I guess there was a lot of energy. I think it was the aftermath of the Wind Waker thing where people started to think, is this really what I want? I don't know. But it was still a very electric room for that reveal.
Nice.
And
yeah.
Nintendo, I always thought Nintendo reveals were a bit more high energy because they would invite a lot of fan sites. Nintendo, right? They would invite like smaller fan sites, and those are some passionate fans, right? Versus like every console had its fans, but the Nintendo fanboys are like they've been around, and they've had several generations of systems to get fanboyish about it. So I think when they helped kind of up that energy because you had sort of like the more quote unquote professional outlets, like the big magazines and the big websites, but then there's also like the ones who are like just raw fans who are like they can scream and yell and get excited about Link, where maybe it'd be like less appropriate for like us, right? But
So you're saying they didn't hire actors to be in the crowd? Like, remember that was the big thing with Microsoft E3s for a while, was they always had like the beautiful crowd that was on the other side of the stage to react to everything that was being said on the stage. I always thought that was funny.
Is that really a thing?
Oh yeah.
Is that,
Yeah, that
Wow.
was a thing.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Devious. That's devious. It's funny you were talking about having quote unquote real fans from fan sites as opposed to the jaded journalists who've been wandering around E3 for 3 days, tired, working the whole time. Bring some excited people here just here for the Zelda reveal. One thing I think about when it comes to just big sea change moments that you guys must have been just elbow deep in was Pokemon.
Yeah.
I mean,
CJ was elbow deep in Pokemon.
I was elbow deep in Pokemon. Yeah.
okay, that was Pokemon was your world.
Yeah, that was my beat. I loved the games. I loved the anime. I sort of lived and breathed Pokemon for a long time. I think we did a feature on Pokemon. We did a couple features on Pokemon, but one that had an episode guide for the for the show. And I had been recording episodes. I would wake up at 6:30 in the morning because that was when it was on in Chicago, and recorded all the episodes on VHS and had them all anyway. So I did an episode guide in the magazine where I summarized like first 50 episodes or more than that, I think.
Wow.
But I was big
50?
into it.
Whoa, 50? Like,
Yeah.
Wow. Wow,
I
that's
took
a lot.
screenshots from all of them too. Like it was
Wow.
it was a fun feature to work on.
That's intense. That must have taken you a good couple of months, I imagine, right? I mean,
Months? What are you talking about?
No.
Monthly magazine.
Weeks.
We do
oh,
this.
okay, wait.
We have to
I
do
don't
this in
know.
a couple hours.
I forget the timeline sometime. Yeah, wow. Okay. That's crazy. So, okay. Wow, that's nuts. And you guys, and Shu and Greg, I know, Greg, you weren't a big Pokemon person. We've had this conversation, I
No.
think. And Shu, was that something you weren't? Because when I was that age, I was kind of aging out of it already. It was kind of like that was my thing.
Well, remember, Shu was pushing 30.
So Shu, you what were your thoughts, recollections around that era with Pokemon?
I appreciated it. I think I like spin-offs like Pokemon Snap better. Like I always thought the concept was cool and the phenomenon was awesome. But the I was never as into it as CJ was. No, nowhere close.
Gotcha. But it really was such a cultural, I mean, it changed so much, Pokemon, as far as just the landscape, but not just video games, but just the way people interacted with it. And yeah, it just really just changed a lot in the landscape. But speaking of lead times,
I think that's
go ahead,
actually
sorry.
what one thing that's cool about working at EGM is like you'd have all these different, like it wasn't as though we had a gigantic staff, but it was just great, like so many diverse opinions and styles, right? Like okay, CJ's super into Pokemon. I might not be. Like I was super into fighting games, and other people might not be. And then there's people like sports games and people who like arcade games and retro games, puzzle games, RPGs. And so you'd always find, like, whenever new games came in, there was always like, oh, there's a small group within EGM who'd be like all excited. There's some that were universal, right? Like when Super Mario 64 came about, like, for example, like everyone was into that and everyone was like checking it out and excited about it. But it's also cool to see, like, for me, like that, oh yeah, there's all these different, really diverse gamers inside of EGM who really like different things.
Yeah, like you would sort of like when the new NCAA football would come out, like you could always count on like Dean Hager and Dan Leahy and Todd Zuniga and a few other people having like a running tournament in the office at all times.
wow.
And there was, Soul Calibur tournaments a lot. And there was, I think it was Jim Cardano and Cyril would have like Tetris, or not Tetris Attack. Well, yeah, what is it? Panel de Pon.
Pokemon Puzzle League.
Pokemon Puzzle League. And CJ, you were part of that, where there was like a big tournament going on with that too. And I think Shu, you were into that too. So there were all these sort of subgroups within the staff, which working in like the reviews and previews section as well, that was kind of, you wanted to know that because you wanted to know who you would assign a preview to that was actually going to be excited about the game that was coming up.
But I think it was important just, and maybe lucky that the staff was made up of so many diverse gamers, that we would have people who were advocates for particular genres or particular things that, hey, we should be covering more of this or less of this. And, Greg with the preview section and Shu with, the overall magazine and review section, and me with news, we would sort of feed off of that and decide what to cover based on what we were into. And I think it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true because, like, even when I was editor in chief, like Greg or CJ or other people like Crispin Boyer, Greg Ford would I depended on everyone else, right? I don't know everything there is about every video game, but then they would come to me and like, this is what I want to do with my section this month, or these are the games I want to cover, and I trust that they knew what was best for their section. So it was great working with like people who are super into games and different games and stuff like that, because I think that's what made the magazine so great.
And that always came across, right? I love when there's different voices and there's different opinions. I imagine that happened organically, because good things generally do. I can't imagine, maybe I'm wrong, that when someone would apply for a position, it's like, ooh, we need a NCAA football fan, or is this kind of like we have a hole here? Or was it more of just, hey, we like your writing, we like what you do, and you fit in, and then organically these different different pieces of the puzzle come together?
I think it's more the latter, and boy, do we have some of the best stories about recruiting and interviewing people and stuff. If you want to hear them,
I would like give me a really good one.
Okay, the best one that I'm sure CJ and Greg have heard this story a million times because I love telling the story. So, especially early on, when you applied for a job at EGM, you had to play a game in front of one of the editors to prove that you actually know how to play games. So, like, I had to play for my test. It was like an unreleased at the time Alien Trilogy, I think, for PS1. And it was nerve-wracking because I'm playing around. The writer was the Iceman. I was like, I would read his stuff. I know you. I recognize you. And I was kind of nervous, right? Because I'm a reader and I had to play this game. So I tried to talk to him while playing a game at the same time. And then luckily I did all right and I beat the level. But we had this one candidate that our editorial director was excited about because he had a journalism background, seemed to be a good writer. And he came in, and then so we're like, okay. After the interviews, they sat him down with us in the bullpen to play some games. So we put up Ridge Racer for him, and then we're showing him the controls. I think the game wasn't out at the time, other than in arcades. And then he was holding the PlayStation 1 controller, and he was like, after we showed him the controls, he's like, how do I accelerate and steer at the same time? And then we looked at his hands, and we saw that he put both hands on the left side of the controller, like left thumb on the left D-pad, right thumb on the right D-pad. So he had no third hand to hit all the buttons on the right side of the controller. We're like, oh, okay, he hasn't touched a controller before, a modern controller. He doesn't know how to play games. We're like, okay. So for a little bit, it was like awkward, and we're not sure what to do. He's already disqualified instantly.
Right.
And then we're like, well, we'll let him play. Maybe he'll surprise us. And then as he was selecting his car, he picked manual transmission. And we're like, are you sure? We all like, we're like, maybe you want to pick automatic because, clearly you don't know how to play games. And then he's like, no, it's fine. And we're like, okay, well, so your accelerate, you have to hold the controller this way. Your right shoulder buttons are your accelerate and shift and whatever they were at the time. And then he played. And remember, like these arcade ports at the time were just strictly that. They're just strictly ports of the arcade game. So the race started. All the cars took off. He's still in first gear, redlining it. It's like, and because he's not shifting up. We're like, well, you pick manual transmission, you have to shift up. So we're like, I think it was R1 or whatever it was. And then so he starts jamming on that button. He just starts like tapping it multiple times, like boom, 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 boom. So instantly he goes from first gear to sixth gear with like very little in between. He's still only going like 40, 50 miles an hour. And then it was just like it was like just loud and not moving and crawling. And he doesn't make the first checkpoint, which in every arcade racer, no one ever misses that first checkpoint, right?
Right.
But he doesn't get to it in time, and then game over. So there was more to it, but that was like the best part. Where like
that's
so
not only is Greg, who biggest racing fan I know, just panicking, I'm sure, as he hears this. Wow. So not only did he not know how to play games, he's never operated a vehicle before. Like he's probably never even understood like what transmissions do, like their function and purpose.
There's a lot of things that went wrong in that like 5 minutes. So,
wow.
but he became kind of a legend. Like I've told that story a million times because it's just so crazy.
Oh my gosh, that is crazy. But it's interesting that a part of your interview process was play a game. Mm-hmm. Because, that's obviously what you're there for. I can imagine even today it happens a ton with hiring. I'm responsible for hiring people now, and you get resumes for people that immediately are not qualified, and you have to suss it out somehow, right, for the position, because he probably was looking for a gig, and games? I can write about games. I can write about anything. I'm a journalist.
Yeah.
Part of the early EGM review or interview process was playing games as well. Like in '94, when they would bring new people in, they would have them play Turrican, Mega Turrican or Super Turrican, because it was a good game that the hardcore really liked, but nobody had played. So it was a good test. And then also R-Type 3, they would put somebody on that and see how they were with a shooter as well as an action game. And I always thought that was really interesting. They picked two very hardcore loved games that normal people probably wouldn't have played.
Right.
So
that's a brutal game. I'm terrible at shmups, and I would never get a job.
Yeah. I thought we were mean to another candidate once. I think he was actually like the grandson of the CEO, like Cameron Zip or something. But we had him play it was a submarine shoot 'em up. I forgot what it was. It was probably PS1, PS2 era. But it was like brutally tough. And then in hindsight, we're like, we probably shouldn't have given him that game. That wasn't really fair. Because it would have been tough for anybody.
Just wanted to take a moment to thank my wonderful, lovely patrons, Seth Sergil from the All In Podcast, Dan from Retrologic Podcast, Pete Harney, and then Ryan from the Gamers Week Podcast. I know it's only 4, but we're getting to the point where I actually need to write these things down and read a list. Not quite. I think when it gets to 6 or 7, then it's all over. I'm not going to be able to remember, but it would be good if I got to that point. Force me, challenge me to remember things by going to patreon.com/A Gamer Looks at 40. $2 gets you early access to episodes, polls, and all the other sort of things that eventually make their way to podcast servers and sites. Once again, that's patreon.com/A Gamer Looks at 40. It's very interesting, Shu, as you were kind of talking about, because I do want to also get into the different roles. Greg and I have spoken about his role on the review crew in a previous episode. But I definitely want to hear a bit about more, Shu, your role as editor-in-chief, because you're overseeing the whole operation of the magazine. Were you more focused on reviews, on that side of it? I mean, layout, or what was kind of your main focus, even though I know you were kind of looking over everything?
Yeah, it is everything. So I left EGM in 2000, I believe, and I came back in 2001 because I was lured by some, like gamers.com was like hiring a bunch of people, offering a lot of money. And then so I wanted to look at this opportunity. But then everyone got laid off. Like that was like the .com boom bust days. Yeah. And then luckily EGM had an opening because our old editor-in-chief, our former editor-in-chief, John Davison, I think at the time he went over to run official PlayStation magazine.
Yeah, he did.
Editor, right? Yep. And so then EGM was looking for an EIC editor-in-chief. And then so they reached out. And so I was really fortunate because one, the timing was great. You know, I left EGM and then there was an opening and they still wanted me back. So thank God I left on good terms. Two, I still had a lot of the relationships and the familiarity with some of the team. Like when I went back, there was definitely new hires there whom I haven't worked with before. But luckily, like the bosses, like the publisher, Dale Strang knew me, John Davison knew me, and you know people would vouch for me. But I had to interview, like everyone else. But then, so when I came back, it was a little strange at first because it was like, hey, these are my friends that I worked alongside with, and now I have to be the boss as well. But the nice thing is, like, it's always like once in a while I get these tweets where people are like, oh man, I loved EGM. I love the work you did. And I'm always like, I don't like that attention and that credit because I'm like, this was such a team effort, you know, and I know that sounds great of me to say, but I really mean it because like, there's no way, like that magazine was so full of talented people and really super hardworking, passionate people. Like they didn't care. Like we all work long hours and you'd have to work ridiculous hours around deadlines. But, but no one complained about that stuff, right? They were just like, they loved it. They just like, we'll do whatever it takes. I'll pour whatever into this magazine. I'll travel. I'll spend hours away from home and things like that. But there was like, so the roles were, there are people in charge of certain sections, right? So there's like the previews editor would be in charge of the previews section. So anything that's considered like, here's an early look. We're not putting a score or review on it. That's a preview. And then there's the news section, news editor. And then there's a reviews section, reviews editor. And then stuff like that. Features editor does all the features and articles there. And then, so like, you know, like CJ and Greg took care of their respective sections. Other people did. Then we had usually some copy editors, and eventually we moved to a copy desk format, which this copy desk would do the copy editing for multiple magazines because we were all on deadlines on different times of the month, so they would just like shift from magazine to magazine. So they would worry about things like, are we sticking to the AP style guide? Are we consistent in how we use punctuation and capitalization and things like that? Okay. And then we have an art team. So like we had various art directors and assistant art directors throughout the magazine's history, but they would be the ones responsible for doing a lot of the layouts and like, okay, I'm going to put in the graphics, I'm going to lay everything out so that the columns are even and everything's consistent, like the little, because they had their own style guide of like, okay, everything has a certain margin so it looks professional, right, and clean and like consistent from page to page. Like, even though the editorial group, myself included at the time, we would like do simple layouts, right? Like we kind of like, we would know enough about the program. So basically kind of piece together the pages how we thought they needed to be put out in case we were like working on sidebars and things like that. But the art team would make it like put that in that final polish, worked on the covers, make everything fit, the typography, all of that stuff. And then we'd have like usually a managing editor who, they don't get enough credit, I think, for keeping the magazine on track. Because like Jennifer Sal, Dean Hager, they're the ones who like, okay, deadlines are coming up. I need these pages into the art people by this time. The art people, you need to file your PDFs by this time. They make sure that all the pages are getting cycled through the proper editors because like, real quickly, like if like Greg got a preview, he would like, okay, a writer would submit something to Greg would edit it and then get it onto another editor. And eventually it would get to my desk where I would do like a hopefully near final sign off, or I might red mark it and then send it back down the chain to Greg to make some corrections or things like that. And managing editor would usually look at the pages, make sure the pagination's correct, all the files were in on time, that they're all to the right editors at the right time. So like Jennifer would bring me a folder like, shoot, you need to get this done in the next hour in order for us to get this done in time. So I would like stop everything I'm doing, read these things, and then even after all of that, it's like everything's finalized. We have the PDFs back. This is what the printer is literally going to print. We would still do one last check to catch any last second mistakes. And sometimes there were, and we'd have to output those files and things like that. But so I was part of that whole process. But again, all the people in charge of their individual sections of the magazines are the one collecting and doing a lot of the hard work that the magazine was all built on.
I want to follow up real quick with Shu. Shu was talking about how it was a team effort. I remember too when he came back, because Shu leaving, the people who left was one of the reasons that I shifted over to EGM, because there was a big shuffle after a lot of people left for gamers.com, and that's how I ended up on EGM. But when Shu came back, we actually, when there were a couple of final candidates for that EIC position, the staff got to interview them too. Like I remember sitting in a room and Shu and other candidates like telling us what their vision was for the magazine if they were going to take over, which I thought was amazing because, you know, I hadn't worked at a job before and haven't worked at many since where like everyone on the staff sort of had that level of input for something like hiring a management role. But that was kind of the way that place ran. So it really was a team effort. I mean, we all had input on everything, and we all had a little bit of autonomy, especially if we ran our own sections, which I always thought was great too, to have that level of trust from my manager.
No, that's really cool. And I love hearing about just how this all comes together, because I think when you look at a magazine, especially nowadays, I would like to talk a little bit towards the end about print versus online and that kind of shift that's happening and maybe has happened. When you look at a magazine, you just don't take into account all that stuff. Like you said, pagination, fonts, and where things are placed. And even the consistency of the copy, that's fascinating to me, where just making sure everything is punctuated properly while still maintaining the authorial voice of the person doing the actual review.
And we had to. I think we'd have a lot of meetings about stuff like that just to make sure everyone's in line, because instead of having like one group like, okay, we're always going to fix the capitalization or we're always going to fix this punctuation, one of the things I'd like to build into the culture was like, all right, let's share this with everyone, all the editors, all the staff writers and things like that, to lessen the mistakes so we make editing smoother, right? Because let's nip it at the source rather than everyone keep making the same mistakes that someone else has to fix. And that was the responsibility of like the editor in chief, was to kind of provide that vision and that build that culture as well, right? Like I didn't do most of the heavy work, came from the team, but I think my responsibility was also to kind of like point them all in the same direction of like, this is the tone of the magazine. This is the audience we're going after. These are the things we do. These are the things we don't do. And then they just kind of, as long as they believe in that vision, then they do all the hard work to kind of create the great magazine.
I wish I had my Ziff Davis inbox so I could go back to the hundreds of passive voice emails from Shu. There was at least one a month.
You had to say that correctly, though, because it sounds like I wrote emails in passive voice. I'm anti-passive voice, so there's like a lot of me telling the team, hey, this is how you avoid passive voice, write an active voice.
I got that explained to me from, I've done quite a bit of writing in my day for blogs and sites and such. And I remember the first time a editor explained to me what passive voice was, and I had no idea. I didn't go to school for this stuff. And my mind was blown, and I never looked at writing the same way again. She's like, oh, no, Explain it to me. That's very funny. Passive voice, the evil. It's like because it's like it gets in once you start, you can't
So
stop.
easy. Yeah.
And you just keep doing it, and it's just like it's like ants in an anthill.
But I'm serious. There was at least one email a month from Shu about
That's
that.
so
Well,
funny.
not only that too. I think a lot of us would start using tropes that were very familiar to
Yes.
anybody who read video game magazines, like
Pokemon fans rejoice.
Blank fans rejoice. Like, and we had to
Sure.
stop doing that at a certain point, or even in reviews. Like, once you write and read a lot of reviews, you tend to pick up habits of where things sound the same. So there was a lot of focus on, let's not use this anymore. Let's not use blank fans rejoice anymore, or like use question marks in headlines and things like that, or start something with a question as the opening sentence.
Yeah.
So
There was a lot of like collaboration, like Crispin Boyer helped inform a lot of that. And I learned a lot from him, even though
He's great.
He technically, we both started at EGM at the same time. And when I came back, I was technically his boss, but I learned so much from that guy. And a lot of those lessons you're saying actually probably originated from Crispin, because I think he knew a lot of these things and would share them with me, and then we would share them with the wider staff. But I think that was like one of the things was like we all had this desire to continually improve and kind of push like how good the writing could be. So everyone was very receptive to that, and I think that's one of the advantages of having that editorial process of like writer to the section editor and then a managing editor, maybe a senior editor as well, and then the editor in chief. Like you have multiple eyes on it, so we're constantly improving, iterating, and I think that's a big difference between print writing and online writing.
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously with the online world, and again, maybe as we get to the tail end of this, we can talk about it. There are like the deadlines are hours instead of days. The faster you have to get something up that's the key. It's the race to get the content out before anybody else, and things sometimes get lost in translation because of that. But speaking of lead time, because CJ politely teased me by assuming he'd have 2 months to do his Pokemon feature. He's like, "What?" Was there an issue? Was there ever a situation? I'm sure there were, where you guys were tied up against the deadline. We got to get this thing out the door. Something happens. Greg shared with me the state of emergency cover on our episode, the last one, where it was one of those situations you had to make that last minute change. Can you remember a similar time of triumph over almost tragedy?
I remember a lot of tragedy when it comes to deadline. Well, we've had lots of situations where like one big one was Xbox and GameCube were coming out. And then we really wanted to cover both, like one issue, like a kind of comparing the two, comparing the launch lineups, showing all the games coming out for both systems. And then our cover was literally like split in half diagonally, like half was the Xbox console, half was the GameCube console from the top down. And then so it was all really cool, like really ambitious. And then, but that was hell for me to try to sort out, because we were talking about like, okay, we need to get access to these Xbox games months before the X machine was out, right? Because what magazines have long lead times, and then we're like, okay, like, and some of this stuff is just not ready, right? Like the hardware's not ready or the game's not ready. So it's like coordinating with Microsoft of like, we need access to the machine to play these games, multiple games. We need access to the code. Some of them were from Microsoft studios. Some of them were from third parties of like, how do we get this code onto this development machine so that we can play this game early? Same thing on the Nintendo side. Nintendo was the worst to work with this kind of stuff, but they tried, but they're just not good at this kind of thing. And a lot of it was controlled by Japan. So it was like a lot of this all in our deadlines don't move. Like we're shipping to the printer no matter what. Like the printer's not going to be like, go ahead and take a few extra days. Like they have other things they need to print. So when this is all coming together, we're like, okay, this is starting to line up. I think we have enough. We're not getting everything we want, but enough that we could do this story or this issue. And then 9/11 hit. This was exactly that time period. And then there's a point where Microsoft had this development kit and they were stopped at the airport and weren't allowed to fly over to go see us from Washington to Illinois because there's this big electronic device that no one in security recognized, right?
Wow.
Because this is an unreleased prototype. It doesn't even look like an Xbox console.
Sure.
And even if it did, people wouldn't know what that was because this thing wasn't out yet. So they got stopped, and then I don't remember the exact details. I don't know if either of you two remember, but
I just remember that the guy who was in charge of bringing them, and I'll say this because he was joking about it at the time, but he was Middle Eastern. So on top of everything else, he was kind of joking about the fact like, oh, and by the way, I'm this brown Middle Eastern guy, in the post 9/11 world. But he did make it through.
Yeah, they eventually made it through. Because we were on the phones. We're like, you gotta come, like we gotta do this issue. And then they're like, I think it was like maybe a day delay or something like that. And then they eventually were able to get it out. Nintendo pulled some miracle. I don't know how we pulled this off. But because all that stuff, they couldn't ship it to us. They were like, so it had to be escorted, like this top secret prototype hardware stuff that they're like, it has to be escorted by somebody with the authority to carry that stuff over to show it to us. So then they would come out and then they'd hang out with us for 3 days. It's just like and then everyone was like, all right, Microsoft's here for 3 days. Like we're just like, here's who's playing what, and everyone just like assign them, and everyone's like locked in this room. It's like back to back to back, and just squeezing in every possible hour we could out of these machines while they were there.
I think though, and I've always thought this because the issue we churned out from that is one of the ones that I'm the most proud of for my time at that magazine. And I think actually that issue, knowing what went into it, kind of proves out what you were saying earlier, Shu, how we were really a well-oiled machine by that point, because there were a lot of curveballs thrown during that month, like what you described as one of them. I remember one of the other things was that Rogue Squadron was there, and like halfway through Nintendo's visit, we found out that it was actually reviewable, and we decided, well, we're going to review this. So you, me, and Crispin actually ended up staying overnight to play through the game. But I mean, there was a lot more to that because we had to organize to make sure that we could do that. We had to make sure we were, all these reps that were there, we had to feed them and make sure that they were well taken care of as well. So Rogue Squadron suddenly moves out of like the bigger cover story. It's still there, but maybe not as big, because now we need to shift pages around to make sure it's got room in the reviews section for like a full page review. Like there was a lot of changes going on that entire month, along with all the chaos of just having these two new systems that we were all trying to play and get familiar with and write about. And it ended up being one of our best issues.
And not only that, it was a holiday issue, which are, larger than normal. So you had the same amount of staff that had to churn out this huge issue.
We were still doing a regular issue. There was still a regular preview section and a regular news section and all the other reviews too.
Yeah.
Like, there was a lot happening that month.
That's massive. What a story. Wow. And again, and I love the fact that, Greg, you had to take a lot of pride in that, because what came into it and how that went. I was looking up just kind of, not stalking you guys. I wasn't doing that. But I was kind of going through and I was reading some articles and things you're mentioned in. And I noticed a few interesting things. Firstly, Greg, evidently you famously gave Chrono Cross a 9.5 in Electronic Gaming Monthly at some point. And you re-reviewed this on Player One, I think like 5 years ago. What are your thoughts on that now? Do you defend that 9.5? Because I didn't get a chance to listen
I think history has not necessarily proven me correct, but more correct than my coworkers who gave it 10s, which I believe were Mark McDonald and Sam Kennedy. But the whole controversy that came out of that, I mean, it was bad enough. But if you go to that issue and you read the little intro blurb or the Game of the Month blurb, because Chrono Cross did win Game of the Month that month. Mark McDonald wrote those because he was the reviews editor at the time, and he specifically called out that I cost the game a platinum and that people should send me hate mail in that issue. So
no,
it was all Mark's fault. That is as infamous as it is. But yes, I absolutely stand by that.
I love this, by the way, because I'm sure they're all reviews that we probably regret a little bit in hindsight.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh no, what is he going to bring up? What did I do 15 years ago? Oh no.
No, and I bring it up because not to tease, a little bit teasing, but not to tease.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine.
Oh, it's because and I've done I used to do film criticism for a really long time. That was like my first writing gigs were film critique. And I used to get it too, right? I give a movie a 9 out of 10. And then I think back about it like 5 years later. I'm like, oh my God, really? Really 5 years ago, Bill? Like, that's what you did? So we all have those moments. These little nuggets I found were interesting. Like CJ. Like a lot of video game magazines of the time, a lot of video game magazines of the time relished the April Fool's joke.
Oh, yeah.
That was always a thing. GamePro had like a little 4-page spread or whatever. Game Informer did the same thing. Or CJ, evidently you were the April Fool's joke person. And you were quoted in an article for IGN saying that the Sonic and Tails in Melee ranks as one of your favorites. Your favorite machinations that you thrust upon your readers. Do you have like a number 2 that you look back on and you're like, man, I really got you. I got you guys.
Well, one I really liked was we did a news story about that the Sega Neptune, that some units had been found in a warehouse and that they were being sold online. And in the article, I put a URL in there, obviously for people to go order them. And I owned the website that this went to, and it had a counter on it, like how many people had hit the buy button. And then it would bring you to a page that had the counter and would play a sound clip from Spaceballs and went, "Fooled you." And
you did all that? You made that site?
I did that. Yeah, I made the site. And I thought it was great fun to see how many people got fooled, and that people would believe that the Neptune, which was a hybrid Genesis and 32X that never actually came out, that people would believe that there were units produced available for purchase online. I thought that was a really fun one.
That is really fun. What did the counter get up to?
Oh, I don't remember at this point. I wish I still had access to that site, but it was thousands. It was definitely thousands.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
How
CJ,
funny.
did you do the realistic Wind Waker story?
I did not. That was after I left.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
That was one that was funny because I remember it was a news story a fake news story that we put out that said that they were going to Nintendo was going to re-release Wind Waker, but with realistic graphics. And then we got angry calls from GameStop and Electronics Boutique, I think at the time, it got back to us that they were so irritated at us because people would be coming into the stores wanting to pre-order those and demanding and showing them the magazines like, no, this is a real thing. And then they were confused at first because they were fooled as well. So there's my favorites were the ones that would cause like legit mass mainstream confusion.
That's mass panic.
Yeah.
Well, my favorite part about the Sonic and Tails thing is that I think Nintendo Power had to print that it wasn't real, and like their game counselor line, their tip line, had some like pre-recorded message like, if you're calling about Sonic and Tails in Smash Brothers Melee, it's not true. You can hang up now.
Wow. That's crazy. How funny. You made it all the way to the desk or the pages of Nintendo Power.
Right.
Wow.
I mean,
Did you ever? Yeah.
It was fun
Sorry,
to do that stuff because, like Shu, like Greg, like I read EGM. That was my Bible back, growing up. Mm-hmm. And I loved their April Fool's jokes and really relished in being able to come up with them and try to fool people. And, the Smash Brothers Melee thing, a lot of people bring that up every April Fool's Day. And I love it. I love that I caused some people emotional trauma.
The GoldenEye one was also caused a lot of pain, and people bring that up to this day.
Yeah. What was the GoldenEye one?
I don't remember who came up with that. Was that you, CJ? Was that your concept?
No, it might have been Mike Vallis.
Yeah, because I know the art team really worked on it. They made a player select screen that used all the different Bond villains, I think Odd Job and Jaws. They would colorize it and make it look like they did their Photoshop magic and made it look like a legit player select screen. And then they're like, you can unlock the classic villains. Or no, not the villains.
Classic Bonds.
Classic Bonds. like the
Oh.
Sean Connery and Roger Moore, and that one guy who only had that one movie.
Timothy Dalton.
No,
Not Timothy Dalton.
he might have been
Her
in it
Majesty's
too.
Secret Service was the movie he was in.
Yeah, that guy.
The underwear model.
That guy.
Anyways, and then with some insane instructions on this crazy feat that you would have to perform to unlock them. And then, of course, people spend a lot of time and they're just so mad at us about this.
That's funny. I always like those features because it's clearly the editors are having a blast. Like the writers are having a blast. It's always fun. And I mean, I know people will get, fooled by them, but it's almost, if it's too good to be true. Although Sonic and Tails, and that's a really devious one, as is that Goldeneye.
That was. And I thought it was important that we not forget about that April issue, because when we were working on the April issue, you got to remember with print lead time, and then also the magazine would hit the stands the month before the date that was on the cover. So we were working on the April issue in like January or something.
Oh, wow.
like that.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
we had to really think about that. And there was one time, there's a Beavis and Butthead issue of EGM that was the April issue where they actually forgot to do an April Fool's joke, but people were so used to it that they like wrote in what the possible jokes were, and there was no joke in that issue. So they came up with the idea that a typo on the cover was the April Fool's joke, which is a lame excuse. It was not true. That was just a typo on the cover. They put a third E in Streets of Rage 2 or 3.
Oh, boy.
And but I thought it was important to, maintain that fun, even though, the April issue would come out February 25th or whatever.
Wow, that's funny. That's really good. So with our last few minutes, I mentioned earlier how, obviously print media is rapidly going away. And I think there's a sadness. I think not even just from a nostalgic point of view, I think that's kind of sad that's happening, in favor of online, and all of us do online things. We read stuff online. What do you think we're really losing? When you think back about your time on EGM and what you were able to create with that magazine and that kind of carefully curated content over the course of, months, putting together these magazines in different stages, what are we losing with the loss of magazines like EGM in favor of the quickness and the expediency of online?
For me, I think it's even though we were on relatively short deadlines, there was a certain mindfulness that went along with this. And like you said, everything was carefully curated. Everything that was in a monthly magazine went through this process where it was checked and double checked. And we sort of, had a moment to take a breath and say, like, is this the message? Is this the right thing to put in? Is this newsworthy? That sort of thing that I feel we've lost. And that we're losing, I guess, because now you're not fighting to have it in the issue you're finishing at the end of this month. You're fighting to have it out in the next 5 minutes because someone else might be 4 minutes faster than you. Yeah. Like it moves. The cycle moves so quickly now that it's become noise much more than it was then. I think is really what we've lost.
Yeah, I agree. I like planning out a month or even months in advance, and because we're planning together a package, right? Of like, here's the cover story, here are the big features, here are the news and previews that are going to go into this magazine, and then so you're curating this, like, here's this bundle of content that we're serving you that should all work together when you're flipping through it. And it's like from the front cover to the last page of the magazine, it should all be great. Every single page of that, versus what Greg just described. It's like doesn't matter. Just like whip out a story and put out the next story. And that's one of the reasons why I left media to do other things. And then I haven't had a big desire to go back to traditional online media. It's like, and I know everything I'm saying makes me sound super old, which is fine, but it's like that need to churn out as many stories as you can as quickly as possible to get the most traffic is not as appealing to me, like in kind of creating that content and that kind of environment. And it's better today to be fast and inaccurate than to be slow and accurate. Like the internet, absolutely, with social media, with the SEO, everything, it all rewards you for being first. So And I don't like that, right? Like, because when we would edit our stories, it's like not just for grammar and for punctuation and for consistency, but like, are we answering all the questions? Like, did what you just write raise a question that the reader might have that we didn't answer? Sometimes it takes multiple eyes to kind of catch that kind of stuff, but it's like, sure, that's part of that process of like refining that story. Like, okay, hey, go back and ask that person you interviewed this follow-up question, because this would be something that might come up and that we'll need to know, right? And then you just don't have time for that kind of stuff in the online world, because you have to beat the other outlets to this breaking news or whatever it is. So I miss that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I miss that kind of stuff too, and as well as like fact-checking stuff. I was in charge of the news section, and I was big into like verifying sources on things. And, you look at a lot of online news media now, and oftentimes you'll just get people copying stories off of each other without like independently verifying anything or contacting the source in any way to ask any questions or follow-ups. And to me, that's disappointing. Like, I wish people would have the time to take that breath, take that moment to ask additional questions or verify things. And we just don't get that. I remember we agonized over whether we were going to run a story on Metroid Prime's tumultuous development cycle. And, I don't know that would be a conversation that would be as involved today. I'm just not sure. And there were a lot of things too when we were reviewing a game. You had the time, sometimes anyway, to think over whether that score is correct or not, or if you wanted to change it. Like, you had a little bit of time. It didn't immediately go up. And I think that was important at the time. I think that's important now, but also the magazines of the past, not only EGM, but places like GameFan and Game Informer and GamePro had, a personality, had a tone that you could identify with. When you were reading those magazines, you knew what you could what to expect out of their coverage. And I don't get that from a lot of the larger sites today. People churn through pretty quick, and there are examples of people who gain notoriety and a fandom of their own and kind of cultivate that. But you look at the people who are doing the daily work on IGN or GameSpot or, any of those sites, and oftentimes you won't recognize who that person is who just wrote that story. You don't know anything about their tone. You don't know anything about them. And I feel like that's something that's also missing, that I certainly miss from the days of old.
Yeah, there's a lot more noise now too, because with social media and stuff, like anyone could put out updates or share updates. So you get your news from a lot of different sources. And I think there is a lot of good, like deep, long form or investigative pieces out there. You'll occasionally see something from like GameSpeed or Kotaku or Jason Schreier and places like that, where they'll do like great work. Yeah. But what's always disappointing me is like, it's always a flash, because I worked in online media a lot, long after EGM as well, with like my own website and also GameSpeed. But it's like, you could do something really awesome. You're really proud of. You spent a lot of time on this, a lot of investigation, talking to a lot of people, and it does really well. And people are sharing it, and people are like, "Oh, it goes viral, and it does great traffic for you." And then a day later, it's like, on to the next thing. It's kind of quickly forgotten about. So that work is there, but just there's so much of it gets drowned out really quickly, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, I will say also, like, in this new era of covering games, I love the fact that some sites and some fan communities can be so specialized. Like, if you're into fighting games, there's an outlet for you that only delivers news about that. Or if you're into Fortnite, there's places that you can get news only about that. And like, it was sort of something we started doing later in the magazine, which is devoting more time to games that are already out, that people are playing. And I just find coverage of that stuff anyway, like, to be much more satisfying these days when you have people creating content about the games that they love. Oftentimes that stuff they're doing because they love it, and they're not doing it because an outlet is paying them to do it.
Yeah, I think those are all really, really good points. For me personally, it's the tactility of a magazine and the intimacy. And I think Greg and I talked about this again on a previous episode or at some point, where when you're sitting and reading a magazine, there's no notifications popping up on the page to distract you. You know, you can just sit and read it, hold it. And like you said, Shu, really, really well, there's a curated experience of going through a magazine. I still love going to, my mom's house, where the place where things are buried and never and never age, and just finding some old editions of, again, I was a subscriber to GamePro. Even finding those, just flicking through them is a really cool, not just nostalgia trip, but experience. So sorry to end on a dour note. Why is print media dying? But guys, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And Shu, by the way, you did not escape my dirt digging research.
Awesome. What do you have?
No, I don't know. It's about Halo and Microsoft and Fanboy. I don't know. I didn't read into it too much. I didn't want to go through the noise. But anyway, obviously teasing. But guys, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I have like 3 more pages of like notes and stuff. I could do this for another hour, but obviously we all have our schedule. So maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Be happy to. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, this is great.
Once again, thank you so much to Greg, CJ, and Dan for joining me for this conversation. Had such a good time learning more about EGM, and I meant it. I really hope I can get the guys back for another round of questions and conversation, because it was a lot of fun learning about that era and hearing their stories and experiences. If you want to check out what Greg and CJ are up to, check out their podcast, Player One Podcast, P1 Podcast on Twitter. It's an amazing show. It's like one of those benchmark podcasts of gaming, and it's a really cool time. There's 800 something episodes, but just pick one to start with. And if you want to keep in touch with Dan and check out his goings-ons and the multiple projects he's involved with, follow him at DanShu HSU on Twitter. And thank you for checking out the show and being a fan and a friend. As always, Twitter is where I can be found most of the time. A Gamer Looks at 4040 on Twitter. There's a link in the bio. Click it. All the podcast things are there for your podcast clicking enjoyment. And until next time, continue being awesome.